problems that we're facing have to be solved by, Indigenous leadership, Indigenous communities, Indigenous organizations.
According to an internal document, the federal government does not have a willing partner to help legislate fire codes on First Nation reserves across Canada. The details obtained by the Canadian press were included in a note prepared for Indigenous Services Minister Patty Hajdu last fall ahead of a meeting with the Assembly of First Nations. It showcases the issues the department was running into when it comes to improving fire prevention. For decades, house fires on First Nations have caused deaths and injuries at a much higher rate than off reserve. Factors for this include overcrowding, poor structural conditions, and inadequate ventilation. Catherine Strongwind says there are several First Nations reserves that do not have the resources available to deliver the services required under a code for fire prevention.
Many First Nations don't have a fire truck even, or running water in some cases. So to implement a code is really difficult across the board when there are so many concerns on reserve already.
It is the federal government's responsibility to pass legislation.
Blaine Wiggins from Indigenous Fire Marshal Service says First Nations are the only jurisdictions across the country that don't have any established regulatory standards for public and fire safety.
The health and safety of First Nations are still responsibility of the federal government. So to be in a position to say we're not going to do anything because we don't have a partner doesn't eliminate a fiduciary responsibility that has always been there.
Back in February 2022, 3 people were killed in a house fire in a northern Manitoba community. Chief David Monius of Pimicikamak Cree Nation says the federal government should provide more funding to First Nations to have the capacity to fight fires, including fire halls, proper running water, and better support for firefighters.
They have to do rigorous training for all firefighters on reserve. The firefighters need that. They need that support. They need the equipment, they need the training, and they need to get paid properly.
He says there is only one active fire truck in a community that inhabits over 9,000 people.
There's education to the community and training to the community in terms of how to do these things. So that needs to be increased as well in order to keep our community safe.
Wiggins says while there isn't a clear path forward for legislation, he says there is a clear path forward for action.
Just investing in the human resources would pay for itself in not having to replace capital around that infrastructure.
In Winnipeg, Alex Karpa, City News.